Start. Buttons. Should I do a dance? Very nice and like. No one likes a heckler. I love you. Shut up. Are you finished looking at goat porn? Never finished with that. So, before we get started, I'm these two gentlemen. I can't speak English anymore because I've drunk too many beers. I will give 3 delicious beers for free to the first 3 people that stand up and say Cyberwar really loudly. No one? That's one. Someone from there. Come on. Stand just, it's one word. There we go, too. One more from this side here. No one? No, you have to stand up, pansy. I will walk to you with it. Thank you. So while I get beers, Josh Coleman and Jericho. I have no idea what they do. I know he likes honey badgers a lot, and he scares the pants out of me. But they're going to talk about Cyberwar and stuff, so I will fetch beers for these people, and they will talk about cool stuff.
Hello everyone, thanks for sticking around after the meal. I know for the 5 to 10% of you that came over from the States, you're not used to a con running this late. So, Cyberwar, now that we got it out of our system, we understand it is a douchebag topic, and that's why we picked it. We want to hopefully inject a little bit of sanity into it, and we're going to do it hopefully over the next hour. The goal is for you to walk out of here thinking, you know, Cyberwar, people are missing the point, so we'll see. The art, by the way, through all of these slides, the actual pre-done images, Mar, my friend and artist that we use, she is available to do your slides as well. So, we have bios, they don't mean a whole lot. There's one thing you need to take away from this. We are not experts. Not on Cyberwar or pretty much anything else. We just kind of look at a topic and say, the rest of the people seem to be missing it, and we give our take on it. So, at first, I said, well, yeah, sure, we can do a talk on Cyberwar, and Josh is like, Cyberwar? What? He didn't quite get it. One of our big problems is the word alone is what Josh calls a thought-terminating cliche. When you hear the word Cyberwar, what's the first thing you think? Oh, exactly. Bullshit. And largely it is, but it's not the fault of the word, it's the dumbasses who use it. So, 3 parts. We're going to do failed analogies. We're going to explain why the term has been abused, why it's wrong. We're going to talk about what most people agree on. We'll set the stage for, yeah, maybe a few people will disagree, but they don't count. And then a bulk of the presentation will be, what else is there about Cyberwar that many people haven't considered? Throughout the talk, if we are not clear, or if you find a mistake in something we say, go ahead and speak up. If you want to discuss a point at length, please wait until after the talk. Oh, yes, and real quick, just to give you a fair shot, free beers to anyone who can tell us the number of times any squirrel appears in the presentation. Go. Any squirrel. Okay, so you're all caught up, right? And by the way, we asked on Twitter before the talk and no one got it right. So you'll look like a rock star if you get it. Failed analogies. When you think about Cyberwar, you were largely influenced by the media. And what did they give us? They give us this kind of great picturesque, doom and gloom. I mean, read this. Chinese DDoS packets are blotting out the sun. Absolutely retarded. And of course there is a disconnect here. Because you have what the media gives us, and then when you think of war, what do you think about war? It's a little more graphic. It's something that we don't really care for. Yet, magically, we get ourselves into them all the time. How about the pundits? You'll notice the date on this. This is very recently. Digital WMDs. Yeah, so that's what the pundits are using and influencing us. Every time you read an article, even if you dismiss it, these kind of words are drilled into your head a little further. So that leads into the buzzword hype. What have we been dealing with? The electronic or cyber Pearl Harbor, cyber 9/11, cyber apocalypse. Yeah, if you guys were doing the drinking game, you'd be out cold by now. We have electronic Hiroshima, but that's not good enough. Then we had to have Cybershima. And then we had Cybergeddon and Cyber Atomic Bomb. So again, where's the disconnect here? That's Hiroshima. When we talk about that word, that's what we should be invoking, not DDoS packets blotting out the sun. So along with the pundits, we also have experts. And there's a lot of history behind the word cyberwar. This is not exhaustive, but I did spend some time trying to figure out where cyberwar came from. The first occurrence I found was January of '92. I found another one in June '94. And later on, you can go back and read these. And by the way, if you download our slides, there is a metric shit ton of notes that go along with this. They give lots of additional references. We cite all of our sources, and up ahead on a couple of these slides, you'll be like, yeah, cite your source. Yeah, I got a Google spreadsheet for that. And it's big. So, June '94, and you'll notice that these quotes, they're very different uses of the word. So moving on, December '94, we have another weird one. September '95, that's when it really gets into more the classic use of the word that we know. Information war, cyber war, net war. Experts, a lot of history behind this, especially at RAND. RAND was basically the first company, think tank, circle jerk group, whatever, that came out with papers about cyber war, and they defined it. And these two guys, you'll notice the top paper there, very bland, very level-headed, right? And then almost 20 years later, RAND, one different guy there, wrote a new paper, and all of a sudden we see the atomic bomb again. So the interesting part about this is that RAND actually keeps a fairly level head through at least 50% of those papers. They're not bad. You know, they get a few things wrong, which I'll go into, but then even they have to go back to the rhetoric. So yeah, we have a lot of experts. When you think about how many books are written on cyber war, I'm pretty sure that's more than the time cyber war has occurred. Like I said, so little actual cyber war, there's a lot of experts. If you go to LinkedIn, there's at least 14 cyber warfare officers. Interesting. And by the way, that's in the US. And I understand this talk is kind of US centric, and I apologize for that to the Europeans, but we are really good at fucking this up. So we should take the brunt of it. The main problem is many people aren't speculating, they're speaking definitively. That's one of the things hopefully we will avoid. We will be very clear that we've got ideas, they may be right, they may be wrong, run with them. Experts in reality. So this is RAND. Over 20 years, the think tank. Go ahead and read this one. Anyone see a problem there? Why is it stupid? Hackers have 1 0 day. Yeah, so in Rand's mind, they think that private hackers have a single 0 day maybe. And that was in 2009. Did they just not read the rest of the internet? Lots of experts at conferences, and I know there's a bit of irony here. So, you see cyber war talks, left and right. And by the way, these are all the ones from DEF CON 18 only. One con. Yeah. And this con has 2 talks on cyber war and 1 training session that had cyber war in the title. Lots of news, which I have recently dubbed as stupidity. People love quoting Sun Tzu, but they love to get these little buzz quotes and then just kind of throw it and say, oh, that's cyber war. You know, we'll kind of make that work. A couple of us wrote an article a while back where we showed that not only is it stupid, but we could shoehorn in quotes from Genghis Khan, Mark Twain, Hitler, scroll proverbs, doesn't matter. You can take any buzz quote and make it fit your need. So there's lots of laypersons. If you read Twitter, look for the Cyberwar hashtag, and you'll make it about 5 minutes before you close that column out because of the amount of stupidity. Yeah, he's a little deformed here. So the Pentagon, the U.S. military, in 2009, they had a paper called Defining and Deterring Cyberwar, where they define cyberspace. They make very logical points regarding the definition of cyberwar, but they never actually define the word itself. So it's like, hey, we know kind of the battlefield, we know kind of what's going to be involved, but no, we're not actually going to define what cyberwar means. And yet 2 years later, the Pentagon sets the stage and says, well, we are going to respond to acts of cyberwar. But hey, we're still not going to define it. So yeah, the Pentagon disconnect. If cyberwar is actually war, why doesn't it actually trigger anything on our side? You know, we have the DEFCON system. When was the last time that changed? Not recently. And when was the last time it changed because of a cyber attack? Never. So again, the Pentagon's really missing the big picture here because they don't know what they're doing, but they have to do something and they know it. So there's lots of reasons behind cyber war. These are some of the headlines of news articles, and you'll notice the amount of money being thrown at it. So there's an obvious motivation to not only talk about cyber war, but to say we can launch it, we can defend against it, we can do whatever, as long as you give us millions and billions. And all of this leads into the definition of war, which I started on, and how we've been blurring the lines. We had the war, then we had a Cold War, and then the US got real brilliant and said, hey, we're going to go to war, but we're not going to call it war, we're going to call it an operation. And then we decided we're going to have a war on terrorism, war on drugs, you know, and the term war, yeah, the war on poverty, it's just getting really abstract. And then that leaves us with, hey, cyber war. Oh shit, China. Yeah. So, cyber war and infrastructure. That's the big thing recently. People say cyber war is all about attacking the infrastructure, and that's where the real damage is going to come in. So, looking at these, just the underlying parts, cause a nuclear meltdown, took down the financial system, constitute an act of war. What is it really, though? So, let's look at some of the infrastructure attacks real quick. And yes, all of these are referenced in detail in the notes. Which ones happened, and which ones were questionable? I see a whole lot of false. I see a lot of, it might not be, and I see no true. So we keep going, and we finally get a couple trues and maybe a true. But these are the big acts of cyber war that people are referencing. Books are being written on these. You know, if that's the foundation for someone being an expert, when the details are sketchy at best, that's pretty sad. So moving from infrastructure, we go to satellite hacks, and hopefully you caught the talk earlier today on satellite hacking. Very cool talk. Hopefully I'll talk to the guy who did that later. He had probably some that I don't, and I probably have a few that he may not, we'll see. But satellite hacking, for all the joking, largely true. These are incidents that are kind of scary. The one that most notable is, I think it was Landsat 7 in 2008, experienced 12 minutes of outage. And you think, no big deal. But the fun part is they said, wait a minute, after that happened, let's check our logs. Then they figured out, oh, it also happened in 2007, and they never even noticed it. So it puts a kind of weird spin on, you know, what is satellite hacking and does it matter? So let's do a quick threat comparison. If cyber war threat is partially or largely based on outages, why are we ignoring the more vicious, legitimate, and historical threat? Cyber war has done what so far? Has it killed anyone? No. Has it melted any power plants? No. There's been outages due to faulty equipment that were attributed to cyber war, outages due to digging, and outages due to squirrels. Yes, innocent little squirrels. So I've got a theory. I think squirrels are a more serious, legitimate threat than cyberwar historically. And moving forward, there's a good chance they may still be for some time. And if you don't believe me, let's play a quick game here. Which of these incidents were squirrel and which were cyber attack? So yeah, which one detonated a Hudson County, New Jersey woman's car? Which one took out a Yahoo data center? Yeah. Any guesses to which one is a cyber attack? None. These are all squirrel-related events. Also not pictured here is the squirrel that set a pastor's home on fire, among other things. So yeah, they're little bitches. So, squirrels versus the U.S. power grid. Which states in the U.S. have had a power outage due to squirrels? All of them. Huh? Yes. And yes, the Google spreadsheet I mentioned, I reference at least one incident for every state. So how about squirrels versus U.S. communications? They're getting there. Now, take into account that this is not exhaustive research. This is me Googling for hours, nothing more. If you actually read some of the stats, they get pretty scary. Well, that was power, yeah. Lincoln, Nebraska, 1980. Something like 170 power outages, some 24% squirrels. One state, 1 year. So how about the world? Okay, security?
Can you repeat?
No, don't let him repeat. That's word of mouth. Just shut up and watch the slide, okay? 1 second. Jeez. Okay, so squirrel versus world, real quick. You know, one continent, by the way, doesn't have squirrels on it. The one not affected. Yeah. I actually tried to go through and find every European country, but language barrier stopped that. So, yeah. So that leads back into my theory. The new cyber weapon. You need one agent, one ladder, one jar of peanut butter in 24 hours. And you can take out someone's infrastructure pretty effectively. And the best part is attribution is a bitch. Are you going to do forensics on peanut butter on a power line? No. So, of course, what that's going to lead back into? Scrollmageddon. Okay, at this point I'm going to turn it over to Josh. Please, at will.
Okay, he said 15 minutes and he pretty much stuck to it. It's pretty good. Alright, so now we're going to transition from, now that I lovingly call section 1, where Jericho fists Cyberwar. Now we're going to basically focus on, if that's the stuff that we want to tear down, what is commonly agreed to. And some of these are text heavy, but again, I'm going to fly through them. In general, when you're looking at definitions of war, the key takeaway here, whether we're going to read these to you or not, is armed. So people are thinking about it in very classic warfare type terms. There's also a lot of rhetoric around generations of warfare, first generation, second, third, fourth. But when you get to the fourth, notice you're starting to see this, and I'll read this part. Conflict characterized by the blurring of lines between war, politics, soldier, and civilian, which is something we tend to lose in the thought-terminating cliche, and a return to a decentralized form, which we're going to build upon in the next section. This is really where they're starting to hint at information as a domain, or cyber as a domain, extending into different aspects of cyber war. So one of them is the fifth domain. If you're not familiar with domains, we have a slide on it in a moment. But warfare and budgets and command structures tend to conform to domains, air, sea, land, etc. We're also noticing kinetic impact. There's a lot of people who somehow magically believe that if it's a logical attack in cyberspace, the retaliation will be also isolated to cyberspace. And what we've seen, at least with things like Stuxnet, is logical can do kinetic physical damage or trigger a kinetic traditional response. And there's also a lot of assumptions that this is a nation-state to nation-state problem, which we're going to challenge. But most of the common belief set centers around what nation states should do in their definitions and responses. There is acknowledgement in the RAND articles, and of all the things we read, and he read way more than I did, the RAND stuff tended to be the least sensational and the most grounded. It acknowledges that some of the targets will extend beyond the military. So there could be collateral damage, civilian, private sector infrastructure. And an acknowledgement of espionage. So this is the one that you saw a tweet a couple weeks ago where I said sometimes Wikipedia gets it so wrong. I have a big issue with the word politically there, but in general there's an acknowledgement that espionage is a tool in the tool belt for cyber. Domains is just a way that warfighters talk about, mastery of the sea, dominance of the air. In general, this is a way that it's sliced. There's a lot of debate within the echo chamber of the defense industrial base and the military community that it was not its own unique domain. I heard one general, one four-star say that cyber is the only domain we created, and we kind of messed it up. But in general, we'd like to kind of end some of that navel gazing and just say, yes, in fact, it is a domain. So, domain and definitions of the necessity for mastery domains go all the way back to Rome, Athens, Sparta, etc. So this recognition that you needed to have coordinated effort and cross-boundary effort between your Navy and your land troops. And Spacework pointed out to us that classic Army line that you can lob shells from a Navy vessel onto land, but you can't ever occupy and control a territory without boots on the ground. So likewise, you need some sort of equivalent in cyber. Now, one of the big disconnects is we get wrapped up on that nomenclature. We forget that you don't wage a domain, you wage a war. And that war will be prosecuted across multiple domains as necessary. What are you left with? Right? Okay. We've covered some of this. Okay. Now, a lot of people believe erroneously that cyber war is a U.S. warmongering thing. Maybe U.S. China. People who've been paying attention to U.S. China and Russia. But these people, as far back as 2005, had declared capabilities and investment, these different countries, and many more since. These were the ones represented in 2005 in a paper out of Dartmouth in New Hampshire. And essentially, I didn't even know what that one that looks like the U.S. flag is. That's Malaysia. So when you have countries like Malaysia getting into this is not just a U.S.-centric issue. One more thing is that targets are going to be different than traditional warfare. Obviously, the tip of the iceberg is military targets, military bases, military assets. But some terms you might hear in the US are DIB, which is the Defense Industrial Base, DIB Plus, which are private sector supply chains that the Defense Industrial Base depends upon. But increasingly, especially with some of these state-sponsored espionage campaigns, they're targeting the entire Fortune 500 and above. By my count, based on my relationships, I found 89 of the Fortune 100 companies lost intellectual property to state-sponsored espionage in the last 18 months. So if I've counted that many, it's probably 100 of the Fortune 100 have lost that. So it's bled into the private sector more so than traditional warfare has. And that's pretty much commonly understood. Citizens are part of it as well, but I'm not going to dwell on that because I have a little section on hearts and minds. But we also have to start thinking on modern digital infrastructure. So while we depend on roads and water and power, we're becoming pretty dependent on things like Google, things like Twitter. I mean, you're not going to have riots in the streets if you shut off the internet. Oh wait, you do. Okay, so this is again bleeding into our civilian lives a lot more. And one of the things he found was pretty interesting is private sector backdoors and vulnerabilities were the first one he found documented was in 1979.
Yeah, real quick. So the U.S. Air Force, and there's a blog post on OSPDB about this. They decided to do a pen test against Multics, if any of you remember or read about Multics. And part of the pen test apparently was not scoped very well or like we do today. And so they broke into Multics and they got privileged access. And then, they created a back door. And then, wait, it was on the machine for new builds. And then they said, hey, Multics vendors, we planted a back door. Here's where it is. Here's the lines of code. And the Multics vendor people said, we don't get it. We still can't figure it out. And this went back and forth. And apparently at some point, Multics said, screw it. So they started shipping new copies of Multics, which were one-off installs, but with a U.S. government backdoor in them, because they were essentially lazy. And real quick, the 47 published vendor backdoors, if you've been following the last 24 hours, is now 48 due to PHP MyAdmin, I think. Anyway.
So a lot of people say, well, when's Cyberwar going to come? And we're going to assert to you that Cyberwar is already upon us. You just haven't been paying attention. Based on largely agreed upon definitions of what's going on in those different aspects, it's been going on. It's just not what we expected, and it's not going to be loud or noisy. Part of this is, if you think about prior compromises of military secrets, joint strike fighter planes that are being built in other countries based on designs from U.S. allies, etc. It's been happening. We just kind of ignore the proof points because the thoughts are remaining cliche. And there's also certified pre-owned. There's tons of demonstrably proven manufacturing backdoors and hardware-based Trojans and rootkits in your supply chain. There's all sorts of military folks using certified foundry manufacturing plants, which are much, much more expensive, but if they don't trust their vendor supply chain of the hardware, firmware, software, it's becoming a big problem. And this isn't going to be traditional warfare like you'd expect with big booms and things on CNN. It's more like a perpetual, constant virtual war. And it's been going on for quite some time. In traditional warfare, you have a declaration of war or an act of war. We have no such thing. It's just been quietly, persistently, pervasively going on. In fact, many of the people in the original anti-sec, depending on how long you've been in the industry, are really, really pissed that Anon and Allsec hijacked the term. But the original anti-sec guys who were for full disclosure or no disclosure, they've been talking since day one about the inevitable conflict. The reason you may need a battle chest of your O-dates was for the inevitable conflict. So this is not a new thing. They were probably our earliest cyber warriors or cyber survivalists who had to keep their powder dry just in case. And the bottom line is, it's just not what you're looking for. Now, this was a litmus test question mark. This was, of all the definitions, the least ambiguous. A lot of people are deliberately vague or non-committal. We found this to be a really interesting definition. I'll just let you ogle at it for a moment. We underline the or because it's a little prone to misinterpretation. We found a few examples like the DDoS on Georgia that was done in coordination with the tanks rolling into the nation state of Georgia. Also the Syrian air defense hack, where basically cyber jamming took place to allow a bombing strike to happen. There was a period there that's well documented in the notes, but those didn't really cover it. So we think this notion's missing, such as there's notions in traditional warfare of having dominance of a domain, means you are assuring access to you and your allies and preventing access to your adversaries. So this is the closest thing to a good one, but this is once again an example in the Tala manual of somebody being a little less thought-terminating in their cliche. But let's transition to things that are much more personal, because I happen to have a lot of respect for the fellow hackers and researchers in the room. So we're going to run some scenarios where these are things that I think traditional warfighters simply don't understand about this domain that I think we have unique expertise upon. One of those is that the scales are very, very different. What do you think it costs to develop, design, build, and test and deploy F-22 fighter planes? Cost, right? Or if you talk about the nuclear club, these are the nations who have the capacity to do a Hiroshima-style devastating attack. So the color coding there is how easy it is for that kill chain, right? So obtaining uranium, if you got the money, you can buy it. Enriching uranium, very, very hard. Developing a warhead, hard. Testing one successfully without being noticed from satellites and radiation detection. It's very hard to get a missile that can traverse, an ICB type missile that can traverse long distances, but it's much easier to do a suitcase. And then you just need the willpower to actually do it. So we track every single step of these for developing countries to try to slow them down. In fact, it's argued Stuxnet was meant to slow down one of the steps for Iran. But let's switch to the cyber club. What's the barrier of entry to be very damaging in the cyber domain? Well, you can buy a netbook, learn to hack, not super easy, unless you're a skitty. Find your first O-day, not easy, maybe you buy one. Develop a reliable exploit, much, much harder than finding the original vuln. And then again, mustering the will to use it. But it's actually a lot simpler than that, isn't it? Because now, thanks to things like H.G. Moore's Law, I can buy a netbook, use Metasploit or Shodan or both, maybe even Loik, and then pointy, clicky, hit go. I'm in charge of my laser, right? Now, perhaps you don't think this is very honest. I I did a search for you because you were too lazy. This is Shodan, filtered on PLC with default passwords. Right now, every single one of these PLCs is exposed to the internet and extremely vulnerable. You don't even have to be skilled. I'm pretty sure there's an exploit and some open source framework to execute these. So what could you do? This isn't rhetoric. Ask yourself, based on your skills with your favorite tech tools, what do you think you could do right now with this available exposed information? This is just one. Back to the scales, it's automatable and repeatable. We were trying to do this entire deck without actually mentioning Stuxnet and Flame. We failed, but we were trying. And a lot of people focus on the fact that well, yeah, but that was pretty exotic malware. You know, I heard an estimate that it was $4 million budget. I actually think you should probably multiply that by 10, just a guess. But even if it's a $40 million R&D project for Stuxnet or Flame, how much do you think it costs to make an F-22 or a missile or a bomb? It's pretty darn expensive, and you can't reuse those. We already know there's reuse because we saw plenty of reuse between Flame and Stuxnet. So it's much higher leverage. In fact, one could imagine a toolkit where you I know it's very hard to defeat signature antivirus companies, really, really hard. But you can imagine a toolkit where you can make as many beautiful unique snowflakes as you want. And yes, there'll be a tit for tat arms race, and eventually they'll detect the toolkit. But essentially, it's much, much easier to scale and highly leverage these software weapons. There's also a question which we think could easily be an entire another talk over maybe many, many years, but there was some things called into question of is it patriotic for a security company to deliberately not create signatures for their nation's cyber wars and cyber weapons? So we are not going to cover that, but we wanted to identify it. Now, the boundaries are much, much blurrier in cyber war. When you think of war, you think of sovereign nations, and airspace, and borders, and territories. So these are the way the world looks geopolitically. But there's also logical boundaries. This is how it looks from an intertube's perspective. And it somewhat conforms, but we quickly go from the logical boundaries to the illogical ones, I mean ideological ones, right? And I love this XKCD cartoon, which basically shows the nation states, so to speak, of social media platforms. But one of the things we found in our year and a half of researching and analyzing Anonymous, the rise of the chaotic actor, was these things are not about, these guys are post-national. A lot of that generation doesn't seem to have allegiance to any one nation. They have allegiance to their digital tribes. So whether it's Anonymous, jihadists, Occupy is a global movement, Freemasons, if you want to get old school, original gangsters. Essentially, there are ideological boundaries now which unite people a whole lot more than maybe fleeting notions of nationalism. Quite a few post-national thinkers in the beat, Generation B. And then we've had a long conversation about laws. We really don't know where to stick this. A lot of people have this belief that eventually the laws will catch up. But even in traditional warfare, there's really no legal precedent or legal definition of an act of war. It's basically mostly norms at the UN level, or just assumptions about what counts and doesn't count. And it's more fragile treaties amongst allies and other nation states, and a lot of arguing and politicking at the UN level or the NATO level. There's a lot of talk about laws. It's interesting. We just don't think it matters. Laws are effective against the lawful. They don't really matter to people who choose to ignore it or think they can get away with it. So since we can't really define cyber war, it's going to be much, much harder to legislate against it. So we think that's going to be of limited value, but that's just our opinion, but it's more speculative. Now let's talk about actors. Perhaps one of the largest blind spots we've seen in this whole discussion is the assumption that these will always be nation states, right? So when you think about nation states, there was an interesting article that annoyed me about Anonymous, because there was a public policy piece out of the US saying that Anonymous is a non-state actor, and they thought that that was a clever way to call them terrorists, because Al-Qaeda is a non-state actor. But it was really an at-face value assessment. When you have a state, a nation state, you have extra diplomatic levers. You can do diplomacy, relationships, you can give them financial aid, you can give them military aid and military training. You can cut these things. It's the carrot and the stick. You can provide them or retract them. There's all sorts of UN entanglement when you're at the nation-state level. And you can do trade sanctions, economic sanctions, embargoes, taxes, tariffs. So there's all sorts of value leverage you have when it's one nation-state trying to influence or curb the activity of another nation-state. Unfortunately, there's also non-state actors. And all of those nice value levers we just described go away when they're not a participating identified nation state. They're borderless, nameless, economyless, and often, in some cases, leaderless. And that interesting border dilemma, this is what got me interested in Anonymous in the first place, and other cyberwar topics in the first place, is false flags. Partly because attribution is so impossible. There's so many people doing the work of a nation state, carrying the water, so to speak, but hiding in the smog of war or the fog of war under false banners like Anonymous or pretending to be someone else. I mean, how many attacks from the Russian business network are traced back to servers in China? Everyone says, oh, it's the Chinese. No. Anybody who does forensics knows how unreliable that is. So we have to consider the existence of non-state actors and the existence of the overlap. So pivoting to attribution, basically we think it's impossible. Right? That's the bottom line. I mean, attribution, if it's even close to possible, is really, really difficult. So the geolocation is meaningless. Forensics, as you saw from Dual Core's presentation, can be fudged and obfuscated. Even if you could do it, there's that age-old FBI problem of, okay, whose hands were on the keyboard at the time of that particular thing? And since he's such a sketchy individual who's way too into squirrels, you know, who's paying him to do that? What's his psychological states? Did he take his meds? Did his favorite gerbil get sick? You know, so we have to ask not just who's at the hands of the keyboard, but a lot more. So I think the idea of attribution is interesting. I think we should do soft attribution. A lot of my research on adversary profiling highly encourages soft attribution, but when you're going to retaliate or do counter-strike or offense based on really unreliable attribution, it becomes much, much harder. So back to that kinetic response, there's all sorts of saber rattling that we will retaliate to a logical attack with a physical or kinetic response. And that's really, really damn hard to do if you don't actually know who attacked you. And if you can't reliably know who attacked you. And that's a particularly difficult problem for the area of cyber. All right, now we're going to need some pretty pictures, right? I think we're going to need some pretty pictures. All right, so the packet heard around the world. So, you know, the shot heard around the world historically, you know, was a real game changer. We're asking ourselves, there's been so many different cyber attacks. There have been advanced ones, even though there were a lot of fake ones. We actually saw, you know, power plants go down or water treatment plants, etc. So what will actually rise to the level that would actually make my mother-in-law that concerned? And this is going to be pure speculation, but so far nothing has. Stuxnet hasn't, Flame hasn't, different physical power grid things haven't. There have even been deaths due to some of these attacks, and they haven't risen to the level. So essentially we think until something like a nuclear power plant melts down that strikes and rises to the level of consciousness and concern for my mother-in-law, this simply doesn't exist. All right, so quickly, there's this whole category of warfare which is traditional called non-conventional warfare. So war fighting is largely known, but there's a new school of thought that has a couple different pillars to it. PsyOps, propaganda, psychological warfare, etc. So we're going to talk briefly about hearts and minds and cupcakes. So why cupcakes? There was an MI6 attack on some Al-Qaeda networks. Essentially, there was a server being used to publish a PDF of how to make improvised explosive devices and whatnot. MI6 decided to play a trick, and they replaced the PDF with recipes for America's best cupcakes. And this was psychological in the fact that it was meant to demonstrate, A, we're watching you, B, we have ownership of your assets, C, it's a deterrent to would-be recruits because this was largely being used as a recruitment document and website. So it was a deterrent to say, maybe you don't want to participate. So whether it's cute or not and effective or not long-term, these kind of operations are more to strike fear in the hearts of participants or would-be combatants. And this one caught my attention as well. This private citizen, Aaron Weisberg, essentially did trolling for the win. He was trolling the jihadist website so hard that this guy, in retaliation or frustration, actually revealed his IP address and whatnot, which ultimately led to his arrest. So trolling can be very patriotic if done right. But propaganda is not new. Here's an example of a crossover between PsyOps and propaganda. These leaflets were dropped on Allied forces during World War II. One aimed at the British and one aimed at the US combatants. So I'm not sure you can read it from there. But basically for the British soldiers, you are fighting and dying far away from your country, while the Yanks are putting up their tents in Maryland, England. They've got lots of money and loads of time to chase after your women. The second one is probably reminding these very horny, very far from home soldiers that they're not with their American women, and B, enticing them. So these were attempts to hurt the morale of warfighters outside of their own theater. There's lots more propaganda, which isn't so much to do this is propaganda from your own teams. And the first one is from World War II, and the second one is from Star Wars. And because he hates everything but squirrels, he made me take out the 40 different examples of propaganda I had. But essentially, if you think about this, bits of careless talk pieced together, look how much actionable intelligence about our lives, our employers, and even our military, people are dripping out via Facebook, Twitter, Foursquare. I mean, I know exactly everything Michelle Klinger did today because of Foursquare. Right? She just left the room, so she wanted to get that joke. So, traditional propaganda poster was someone talked, but is the modern equivalent someone tweeted. In fact, there's plenty of exercises in traditional military ranks right now. In fact, there's an entire clone of Facebook just for military people in the U.S. military, so that they're getting the same benefits, but they're not leaking it out to the public. Then there's people in modern times copying traditional World War II propaganda. So Anonymous has pages and pages and pages and pages where they doctored up and photoshopped excellent traditional ones. Can you spot the tape? Okay. But they're not just copying. In fact, Topiary, who just pled guilty in the UK, is a master propagandist. I'm not sure he made this, but the instinct to do hearts and minds campaign, to win the will of allies and to intimidate opponents, is part of warfare. You might not recognize it as warfare, but this is becoming very prevalent. There are pages and pages and pages of some pretty interesting and original artwork coming out of some of the protest movements like Occupy or Anonymous or LulzSec. And whereas you might have seen war posters like this with B-52 bombers in the past, you're now seeing that the rising sun carries DDoS. So it's interesting to see signs and rumors of war, wars and rumors of wars. A sign and a feature of war is use of propaganda. Very quick little section here, but one thing about non-conventional warfare is the notion of false flags. I mentioned that earlier. What's interesting to me is, although every time it says that three-letter acronym that starts with an A and ends with a T, God kills several kittens, so I don't use it. But state-sponsored adversaries love the fact that Anonymous is nameless and faceless and has no leadership. It's created a wonderfully beautiful scapegoat and false flag. The guy I'm quoting here was in the Beltway in a pretty senior position, but he said Anonymous is God's gift to China. But what he's failing to see is it's also God's gift to the Russian business network, to the cartels, to anyone who wants to be able to hide in that smog. One of the things I do separately, and this is just a screenshot from it, is I've been trying to do adversary-centric risk management, both for prioritization, but also for spotting false flags during actual attacks. And an interesting thing is, if you map who's attacking, why they're attacking, the impacts they have, and the assets they tend to go after, you can tell when it's not really the actor it claims to be. Here's an example. Activists, which I think is a silly phrase, they tend to be ideologically or politically motivated. They tend to affect the reputation or personal damage of something, maybe the availability, and they don't go after much beyond websites. So what's interesting is when you see someone saying, we are a legion, in their text file in the attack, but then there's a bunch of fraud happening. It's basically the Russians pretending to be Anonymous or LulzSec to distract you while you're restoring services, and they're buying time for money mules to actually walk off with real kinetic money. So false flags are very real, and it's getting much harder to spot. So another aspect that you tend to think of in non-traditional, non-conventional warfare is the notion of terrorism. In the U.S., our most potent example is how a very, very small group of people could do very large damage physically to life, but also to the way in which causing subsequent wars or infringement on rights and surveillance, etc. But interestingly, you go fast forward, and on September 11th, several years later, I'm sitting in a hotel room in San Francisco, and essentially you saw over 20 countries rioting the U.S. and European embassies after a YouTube video. In what universe can a YouTube video or any form of social media ignite protests? There's all sorts of suspicious stuff here, like RPG grenade launchers fired in killing a U.S. ambassador. They just happen to be ready at the exact time of the video, etc. There's all sorts of conspiracy theories on this, and I'm not trying to promulgate them, but it really got me thinking, how repeatable is this? Could I basically get a protest on demand? Could I cause a kinetic on-the-ground warfare between two nations simply by using meme hacking and social engineering? I think there's quite a few excellent social engineers in this community, probably even in this room. In fact, there was a red team class that was pretty epic just 2 days ago. So what could you do with social media in the hands of people who are brand new to the internet, brand new to social media, and already looking for a fight? So let's get very, very personal now for the last section here, which is, I'm kind of excited about this game coming out, I guess, next week. But one of the reasons I picked this is, we're kind of a culture group who grew up around video games. But also, this particular one takes place during the American Revolutionary War, which emulates and carries through some of the things that I think this room could do. So for the next remaining slides, I want you not to think about this outside of yourself, but what could you, as a citizen soldier or cyber warrior, do? What guerrilla tactics could you use within your skill set to be impactful in any sort of current or upcoming cyber conflict? So, citizen soldiers, whether these are formal or informal militias, that's a US term, but whether they're rogue solo actors, we're trying not to use any one solo actor, but they're individual solo actors getting a lot of press, doing things as private citizens that potentially affect international events. Whether it's some sort of Blackwater or cyber Blackwater, these become interesting. Right now, if someone takes down jihadist websites, they may be interfering with international intelligence operations that we're monitoring those. If we have a few actors, it's interesting, potentially risky. If you have several actors, you start having blue-on-blue or operational collisions, and things can get pretty hairy pretty quickly. So I'm going to mention letters of marque. Now, when you think of militia, you might think of like rednecks in the South, or you might think of war reenactment folks, or you might think of people who fancy themselves warriors, and although there's a lot of talent here, often the militias are the least fit to fight. They're just kind of interested and no one's stopping them. We especially like the guy on the left there, or the two in to the left. Now, a feature of non-conventional warfare is often called guerrilla warfare. Pardon the pun, this is a great boot shirt that I have to buy. But asymmetric warfare is when, or guerrilla warfare is when few people do heavy damage because they break the rules. I think this demographic's pretty well known for coloring outside the lines and breaking the rules. So with a small group of people, you can do larger things. Now, one of the best books on this subject matter, I'm surprised very few people in the infosec community have read this, is The Starfish and the Spider, which is about the differences between decentralized or leaderless organizations like a starfish and centralized or hierarchical organizations like a spider. Basically, the shorthand is if you cut a spider in half, you have a dead spider. If you cut a starfish in half, you eventually have two starfish. So it's wildly different strategies for identifying when to use a starfish and how to fight a starfish. And most people's instincts are incorrect. Jericho would like to replace the word spider with the starfish and the cow because it's a much clearer metaphor. But let's talk about these citizen soldiers, right? I was reading in the LA Times, and I recognize this guy in the picture who I will not name at the moment, but these are civilian hacktivists fighting terrorists online. This guy's doing it from his home office in the Northeast. There's another group popping up. A lot of them I know about clandestinely, some of them more overtly, but this other group here is just one of several where people in our industry, white hats and gray hats, are basically convinced that the powers that be are not doing a good enough job and they need to do their patriotic duty and start surveilling on foreign enemies, or information gathering, or collecting. And while this might feel patriotic, it's rife with challenges and difficulties, and in some of these cases, while they're taking down child pornography sites, or where they're trying to map jihadist networks, they're actually interfering with international operations. And the more that do it, the more collisions we're gonna have. So we're not going to get into this long soliloquy about who watches the Watchers, the Watchmen, but there's a lot of moral ambiguity here, and there's a lot of chance for mistakes. And we're not necessarily, we want to make it very clear, we're not calling for a watch group to watch the Watchers, but we're acknowledging the fact that things can get very, very slippery very, very quickly. In fact, one of the big concerns of the people who've admitted to me that they're joining these organizations or contemplating it is that they're very concerned that their fellow teammates and vigilantes do not share their same value sets, and that they're going to find out very, very quickly how dangerous a game they're playing. So we dug deep and we thought about this, and there's actual historical precedents for this. If you understand pirates, pirates got so bad that basically the different governments in England and Europe and the US decided to anoint, through this policy called Letters of Marque, under this banner called the Freedom of the Seas. They basically created state-sanctioned anti-pirates. So perhaps the most famous one is depicted there, Sir Francis Drake, but essentially to fight piracy that was outside the reach and capabilities of the traditional armies and navies, they anointed people to, within certain boundaries, you could legally and lawfully fight pirates and keep a certain ratio of the booty. So we find it to be potentially interesting to unleash the talent of the hacker community in some more structured way, like they have in the past with Letters of Marque. We also thought about if we were to form, so if you were to grab a few of your friends or a few of your fellow podcasters or a few of your hacker friends to try to form one of these citizen soldier brigades, not encouraging it, in fact, it may be a horribly bad idea, but if you were to do so, how would we architect and blueprint these? Because we weren't brought up in the military. Many of us were brought up on Zork or MMORPGs or World of Warcraft. So I was trying to say that perhaps this new generation might understand the notion of guilds or the notion of differentiation and specialization or pooled resources. And Jericho pointed out, potentially from experience, that there are all sorts of blueprints predating World of Warcraft. Things like the old hacker groups. You know, back when you both were apprenticed and learned your skill and learned your trade or code of conduct and your ethic from the group like, you know, TNO or Greeny World, what was it, Greeny World Domination. So these are just a few, but we actually have precedent for how groups of people who might not even have met in meet space can organize and build trust and do things effectively and clandestinely. We also suggest, and this was the crossover and parallel from the year and a half we spent on the Building a Better Anonymous series, when we were suggesting on how to build a better Anonymous, one of the things we said was they lack a common belief set and common value set, and one of the reasons they can only achieve so much is if you believe something, write it down. So part 5 of the series accidentally turns out to be a pretty darn good blueprint for any group that wants to form the new private citizen intelligence gathering, or work to take down child porn or whatnot. So the idea was, if you can first ratify amongst your cohorts what your first beliefs were, your first principles, your code of conduct, your strategies, your exit conditions, then you knew where the clean and bright lines were. So anyone considering this or actually entering into one of these, we'd encourage them to consider some of the things we posed to Anonymous. Now, perhaps you don't want to be a combatant. We did pose in the abstract that you can either be a warrior, a piece of collateral damage, or a conscientious objector. So survivalism may be your option. Maybe you just want to avoid things. But the interesting thing about survivalism is, since this is bled outside the realms of, if I don't work for the military, they'll leave me alone. We already talked about this affecting power rights. We talked about this affecting your economic conditions in your country. We talked about this affecting your Google or your Power or your intertubes. So quite a few survivalists come up to me at conferences now, and their first question is, how many rounds of ammo do you have? Now, whether this is a question for the zombie apocalypse, I'll let you decide, but the instinct behind that is many security professionals have what's called a bug-out bag. It's a backpack packed with supplies and dried goods and non-perishables and perhaps a machete for the zombie apocalypse. But we started asking ourselves, what is your survivalist strategy to cope with being off the grid or without power if you're in a cold part of the world? Do you have redundant alternative communication technologies? We saw in satellite hiking, you can actually piggyback on satellite technology to communicate. A lot of my friends have ham radios, or they're getting their ham radio licenses. So we're not saying the sky is falling and Armageddon's coming tomorrow, but we are increasingly becoming dependent upon digital infrastructure, and it's increasingly at risk of not being worthy of that dependence. So we think there could easily be an entire talk on how to prepare your cyber bug-out bag, so to speak, and what things might go into that. I have 2 little girls. I'm contemplating at what age I decide to teach them how to hack. It's becoming a critically necessary skill. Hardware hacking, software hacking, social engineering. But what would you do? Because at this point, since we don't believe cyberwar is coming, we believe it's upon us, you essentially have a choice of stepping up or having an exit plan, because we just don't think duck and cover is really an option. So I'm shocked and surprised to say this. Hopefully we made you think, even though we went through a douchey topic, but we are on target for time, and we want to thank a very large list of people who worked on a very uncomfortable topic for a very long time with us. Many of them are named here, some of them refuse to be named, but hopefully we're going to push past the thought-terminating cliche, and we're actually going to start getting people talking about not what it isn't or what it shouldn't be, but what it is and what role you're going to play. I think at this point, this particular community is better poised and skilled than any to find themselves in the fray. And you're either going to be reacting or you're going to be prepared. And I have a hunch that Ed Scotus' might talk about being prepared for that. So with that, we have some beer. We have, 2 minutes for questions?
First up, did anyone get the number of squirrels? Wrong.
You got the
No, 18. I'm sorry, what was that? Beers. 20. Huh? These count?
No.
In the presentation.
Who said 20? In the picture there were 2, yes.
And, well, yeah, the one with the squirrel going across the power line, and then the other one that's common to miss is the nuclear explosion at Squirrel Mageddon. There was a squirrel in there.
People miss that one.
Huh? You can go through it. Trust me, we did several times. The first time I counted, I think, 20, and then I was like, no, there's 18. He's like, no, 19.
Yep.
Yeah, it took as many times.
He created half of them and he missed 2 of them.
So, any questions about the topic?
Anybody, please. You know how painful this topic was to research and talk about.
Actually, not really a question, but I just wanted to point out, because you mentioned the ability of sparking a riot at will, and I just wanted, that reminded me of the Occupy movement. How I guess maybe a lot of people will agree with the Occupy movement, but it also shows that you could start a movement that you don't agree with. I mean, someone could start a movement that you don't agree with, and things like that. It used to be that something like that would take place in one part of the world, and now that can spread to other parts of the world as it has. And also this transition of, we don't have to rely on conventional media. A lot of the media at first ignored what was going on, and social media and groups like Anonymous kind of made it out there and said, if we report on it, people will notice it. I just think that's another example that you can throw up there, just to show that it's not an isolated incident, and that these things can, take place.
Yeah, I mean, we should point out that some of these slides, an individual slide, we had an hour or 2 of conversation debate on that could easily be an entire deck on their own. So there's a lot of room for creativity in that particular one slide.
What would you say these so-called cyber warriors are doing in terms of intelligence services and collection of electronic intelligence?
Real quick, qualify cyber warriors.
People that think they want to attack another state.
So we're talking civilian actors?
Possibly. But you have collection agencies like NSA, GCHQ, and the BND in Germany, for
I
example.
think that turns it into 2 very different questions.
But surely they're going to be targeting some of these organisations with what you would call noisy data to make them lose track of the real targets.
Right.
But do you think that's a realistic scenario?
Absolutely, and like Josh said, so if I decide, hey, I'm going to go after jihadist websites and I start to take them down, am I also interfering with the NSA, CIA, whoever has been monitoring it and getting good leads in the real world, and me taking it down actually burns one of their greatest assets. So yeah, it's not just a noise problem, you actually can turn that into a kinetic loss. My DDoS attack just made them miss out on more leads, tracking down real world bad guys or whatever. And so that's a single quick example that we know as a fact has happened.
Yeah, we didn't have a lot of time to get into it, but right now, without something like letters of marque, which at least gives some rough boundaries and bright lines on what a civilian can and can't do, having 1 or 2 people mapping jihadist websites is an inconvenience. Having 10 or 50 of them would be a nightmare.
Sure. Okay, thanks. We have time for one more before we get the next speaker up.
And then we'll be outside if anyone else wants to move to the discussions or hit Josh in the face, either one.
And thumbs up, thumbs down? 2 thumbs up.
It's late and I'm tired and I don't know how well formed this is going to come out.
Preach on, brother.
So I'm going to insult everybody in the room and say that probably most people in this industry don't hail from smack dab in the bell curve in one way or another. You tend to find certain traits that aren't, well, okay, I think I've insulted everybody. If you take like the million monkeys with a million typewriters thing, I know I'm almost there. Think about somebody like Alan Turing. How many conscripts would it take to be the equivalent of one Alan Turing? And then think about how the kind of industrial defense complex works and the cultural divide between that and the type of mind. I mean, there's a cultural gap there. When I see the Defense Department firing up these cyber commands and things like that, it doesn't make sense. How are you?
Well, it makes sense on some levels, financially, logically, politically, or whatever, but historically, especially with the cyber commands spinning up, no, they don't have any precedent. You know, in some cases, it's interesting, in the US, one of the cyber commands dates back to, I want to say it was 1955, 58 or something. I read this and I was like, that had to be a typo. And it actually a couple of them went into the 90s, and then they got decommissioned. Right as the internet's starting to ramp up, they decommissioned them after 40 years. And it's like, what the hell are you smoking? You know, and then all of a sudden, 15 years later, it's like, hey, we need a Cyberwar command.
All right, and let's also close with a couple facts. There's a lot of talent in the private sector in this community that is lacking in traditional war organizations. Fact number 2 is I know of 24 people who have already admitted to me they're forming or already in one of these citizen soldier organizations, and they don't have a plan, they don't have exit strategies, they don't have first principles or code of conduct. So we acknowledge it's happening. And the third is, you're either going to have a plan or you're going to be reacting. And what we're hoping to do, pushing past this doctrine and cliche and hopefully not ruining our reputations at all, or any more than they already were, is to at least plant the seed that it's time to push past the groaning and eye rolling and actually start deciding what role you're going to play and what a responsible citizen would look like here. Because they're going to come at you. They're going to ask you for help, or you're going to do it on your own, but you're going to be involved.
Just like we tell companies, it's not when you get hacked, or it's not if you get hacked, it's when you get hacked. Same with us. You know, we're looking at when, not if.
All right, with that, I'm going to drink some more beer because I feel like I need a shower after saying cyber that many times. I thank you for letting us do this, and I thank you for
Great talk. Yes? No? So we've got one more speaker up, Fernando. I'm not going to even try to butcher your surname because I'm African. Butcher it. IPv6 security.